Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Ces Butner, and I have the honor to serve as this year's president of Rotary Club of Oakland. Founded in 1908, the Rotary Club of Oakland is the third oldest Rotary Club of some 35,000 Rotary clubs throughout the world. We are a community of 300 men and women from all walks of Oakland's civic, commercial, and community life, committed to Rotary's motto of service above self. I'd like to welcome you to our 5,332nd club meeting. For over 111 years, we have welcomed Rotarians and guests from around the world to our club meetings. We continue to do so virtually, so if you're a visiting Rotarian or if you're a guest of a Rotarian, please let us know by typing your name and the name of your club into the chat box located at the center of your screen, as indicated by the red arrow on the slide you're viewing now. By doing so, we will be able to recognize you later in this meeting. Also, we recommend that all participants view this Zoom meeting by clicking the Speaker View button located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And if you have comments throughout the meeting or questions for the speaker, please use the chat button at the bottom of the screen for that as well. And now, our thought for the day, Rotarian Tristen Connor.
Thank you, Ces. So this week marks the 1-year anniversary of shelter-in-place orders for Alameda County and the state of California. These are grim reminders of a devastating year with incalculable losses. Those impacts cannot be overstated. However, while acknowledging the loss and devastation, today I also encourage reflection on some of the more positive aspects and inspiring developments of late. In addition to the rapidly increasing number of administered vaccinations, dropping COVID cases, and the cautious reopening of many business sectors, which is all welcome news, we've also seen increasing acknowledgement over the past year about vital issues which need to be addressed by our society. Important conversations around our healthcare system have been reignited with new vigor. This catastrophe has brought to the forefront our need for stable, apolitical, science-based, and adequately funded health organizations such as CDC and the WHO. And finally, a bright light has been cast on many socioeconomic injustices and inequities in our society, such as systemic racism, food insecurity, housing insecurity, voter suppression, and the ever-widening wealth gap. Many of these conversations were not being had in public influential forums until this pandemic magnified and thereby highlighted those issues. So once again, as we mark this 1-year milestone of sheltering in place, I urge you to reflect not only on the losses, which are great, but also on the positive aspects of the past year. As a society, we're learning, we're growing, we're crawling out of this horrific pandemic. And may we all continue past these times in the spirit of long overdue societal reflection and action-based positive changes, which reflect the vision and values of the Rotary Club. Thank you, Ces.
Thank you, Tristen, for setting the tone for the meeting today. Because we want to remain grounded and focused, we begin our meetings by jointly reciting our vision, which is together we see a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe, in our communities, and in ourselves. I hope you enjoyed last week's meeting where we had a chance to relax and fellowship a bit as we reintroduced the breakout rooms. We'll be doing that from time to time as we work our way back to in-person meetings. In fact, President-elect Dudley, the AV team, and I have set a goal for the first Civic Thursday meeting of May to have a broadcast meeting from the California Ballroom, and the first in-person meeting at the first meeting of June. That's our goal, at least. Of course, all of this is predicated on Alameda County guidelines changing to provide us those opportunities. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, this week, still in our virtual environment, we will take a moment to recognize all that we've been through with COVID. You'll see it was exactly 1 year ago, as Tristen said, March 16th, that the first shelter-in-place order was executed by our governor. In addition, and taking advantage of our virtual environment, we have high-profile speaker that I'm sure you'll enjoy. In fact, if you've been watching the CNN series, Lincoln Divided We Stand, you'll recognize the speaker today as one of the expert historians featured on that show. But first, we have a few announcements and club business to do. So sit back, enjoy another in the great Civic Thursday meetings where you can catch a great speaker and get involved with Rotary, where service above self exists. Past District Governor Ed Yellen, do we have any visiting Rotarians or guests?
Indeed, we do, President Ces. We have some terrific guests with us here today. Let me see who I can see out there. Let's see. Keith Uriarte has brought with him a political consultant, and so we welcome Julie Wedge to our meeting. Nice to have you, Julie. Thank you, Keith, for bringing Julie to our meeting. Let's see who else. Jack McAvoy brought a couple of guests. First, his partner, a long-time partner at Sylvan Learning, Bill Kramer. Welcome, Bill. And Jack also brought a very good friend of his, Harlan Hirschfield. So welcome, Harlan. And then we also have with us Javare Wilson, who's with the Alameda County Behavioral Health Services. So welcome to Javare. And we have two guests who are only going to be guests for, I think, 5 more minutes because they're going to be inducted into membership. So I'll let them be introduced a little later in the meeting. Thank you, President Ces.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome to all the guests. As you recall, at the last month's meeting, we voted, board meeting, we voted unanimously to establish a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Its purpose will be to function as an advisory resource so that members, club leaders, staff, and committee chairs can get support and accountability they need to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion remains a value priority in all that we do. Today, it gives me great pleasure to announce our inaugural co-chairs for that committee, Rotarians Celeste Gordon and Greg Knight. Let's welcome them. Celeste and Greg understand the importance that the committee's work represents and will guide the committee through initial stages of research, evaluation, and planning to ensure our DEI committee effectively plays the key role in making sure that everyone associated with Oakland Rotary number 3 feels valued, respected, and welcome. We are inducting 2 new members today. They will be introduced by Rotarians Carrie Hamill and Keith Uriarte with 2 interesting facts about our newest Rotarians. Carrie, why don't you go first?
Good afternoon, Rotarians. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Trish McCallman, a great woman who is Trish Connor. I'm sorry, McCallman was her maiden name. A great woman who's a lawyer, an educator, a legislative genius, a mom, and somebody with strong devotion to public service. A few fun facts about Trisha. She loves music. Her first concert was Barry Manilow concert 100 years ago. And her last concert pre-COVID was Radiohead. And she loved both of them equally. Through 20 years of marriage, Trish has moved 7 times to different states, but she's kept her membership at Sequoia Country Club because she knew she'd always end up back in Oakland, and she has. Trisha attended the World Series game in 1989, and she is always one of those people who's the brightest person in the room. She's like a lot of Rotary members. So let's welcome Trish Connor to the club.
Very good. Now, Keith, you have 1 member to introduce.
Yes, I do, President Ces and fellow Rotarians. With great pleasure and honor, I introduce our newest Oakland 3 Rotarian, the Vice Mayor of the City of Oakland, Rebecca Kaplan. Rebecca was born in Ontario, Canada. She grew up living in a universal healthcare system in a family and community which encouraged her to fight for the rights of workers. Rebecca attended MIT as an undergrad, where she actively involved in organizing for women's rights, reproductive freedom, and LGBT equality. Rebecca obtained her law degree from Stanford Law School. She worked in Oakland as a tenants' rights attorney and advocate. Rebecca served for over 7 years on the AC Transit Board of Directors. And in November 2008, she was elected to the at-large seat of the Oakland City Council. 2019, she was unanimously selected by her colleagues as the president of the Oakland City Council. And this year, Rebecca was unanimously selected by her colleagues, the vice mayor of the city of Oakland. Rebecca is Oakland's first openly LGBT elected official. She has successfully fought for support of LGBT youth programs, to end discriminatory laws, and support community leadership on boards, commissions, and community-based organizations. Fellow Rotarians, during Women's History Month, I introduce Vice Mayor Rebecca Kaplan.
Thank you, Trish and Rebecca. We are happy that you have chosen to join us. And please know that your family and friends are always welcome to join us and participate in our projects and events. By accepting membership, you have adopted our vision, which we say is together we see a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe and in our communities, ourselves. You also agreed to conduct your affairs by the Rotary full-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all? You will receive your Rotary pin, and we hope you will wear it with pride and find pleasure and fulfillment by attending meetings, participating in our service activities, practicing service above self, and by contributing to the Rotary Foundation and the Oakland Rotary Endowment. So it is my pleasure, privilege, and honor to induct you as our newest members of the Rotary Club of Oakland. Let's give our new members a warm Rotary welcome. They unmute everybody so we can say thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you too. I'm excited to get involved.
All right, Trish, we join a committee, you join a committee and you get started, and we'll do wonderful things for Oakland as we always do.
I see new members in the AV committee.
Yeah, AV committee. Rotarian Alex Kaffka, I believe you have an announcement from the speech contest, do you? Is Alex here today?
Yes, thank you, President Ces. I've got a couple things, some exciting news and an announcement. The good news first is that kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but Oakland Rotary is going to be sending one of its Interact students to the North Regional speech contest this year. The contest is not yet held, but I'm feeling very confident for different reasons that our students going to prevail. So that's pretty exciting. You know, the real success this year, however, was really kind of the dramatic improvement that we saw in all 4 students in our cohort. And I mean, you saw the results. There were just, 4 incredible, well-delivered, interesting, memorized speeches that these students delivered. And let me tell you, when they first started out, they were not they were shy and didn't have the skills, and really just in the space of 6 weeks, made tremendous improvements. And the key to that success was our mentorship program. It's something that we started this year. We pair Rotarians with good public speaking skills and good, interest in students with individual kids to mentor and coach them in public speaking. And then we use a series of contests along the way to provide feedback about how they're doing compared to their peers. Mentoring is really, I think, the experience of a lifetime. We expect to be tripling our cohort this coming year. That means we're going to need somewhere in the realm of around 12 different Rotarians. We've had some people already step up, plus our mentors for this year are going to be repeating, we think. But we're definitely looking for more involvement, and would love it if you would like to participate. So please contact either myself or Barbara Beery to sign up. Thank you.
So that's why we do it, and you can put it in the chat, and Jesse will follow up with you. It's been a year since our first shelter-in-place order, and we at Rotary have been devastated like the rest of the world. Past President Jack McAvoy has a few words of remembrance for our members who we lost.
You know, it's been more than a year now since we all met together in person. I know we all look forward to that face-to-face interaction again. Unfortunately, 6 Rotarians who were with us at the time of our last face-to-face meeting on March 5th last year have passed away and will not be with us when we return to the ballroom. Please join me in a moment of silence to remember these Rotarians.
Oh my God.
A special comment. Bert Clausen was a 64-year member of Oakland Rotary and lived to the ripe old age of 101. Gene Zajas was a 49-year member of Oakland Rotary, the past president, treasurer for many years, life partner of fellow Rotarian Wendy Howard, and a close personal friend of many of us. They will all be missed. Ces, to you.
I'd like to be the first to ring the bell for our fallen Rotarians. And if you would like to do so as well, you could enter that into the chat and we'll recognize you at the end of the meeting. And I believe we have Chris Zajas, the son of past President Gene Zajas, to say a few words also. Chris.
Thank you, Ces. Good afternoon again. I'm Chris Zajas. I'm very proud to be here today to speak with you in honor of my father, along with my sister Jacqueline, brother Lucas, my dad's sister Eileen Manolis, and as you mentioned before, his life partner Wendy Howard. Being from Oakland is something that Gene was very proud of his entire life, and for the past 49 years, Rotary was the perfect organization for him to express that love through community service. I can remember from a young age the stories of Rotary's local and international charitable endeavors, and our dad was always proud to bring home a flag from some far-flung club he visited while he was traveling. But for Gene, participating in Rotary was not just a civic duty, it was something really fun. He was especially proud of his year as president, and us and the family still have these coffee mugs that the club made for him on his demotion. That ceremony was probably one of the best days of his life. He talked about it a lot, and we know that that year was really special for him. But Rotary was even more than just about fun and civic engagement. The Rotary community introduced him to some of his closest, most loyal, and longest lasting friends. I've gotten to know some of you over the course of the past years. You've lent emotional support and advice to the family as we've dealt with his passing. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. Because of those reasons and more, I'm proud to announce that he directed his estate to make a contribution of $200,000 to the Rotary Endowment. And I know that the organization will put that money to good use that carries out his passion for Oakland and especially for education and youth, two things that he was very interested in and worked hard on. I'm excited to hear stories down the road in the future as to how that contribution has helped to change lives and carry out Rotary's mission. So thank you, everybody, and
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I just want everyone to know how much we all miss Gene and appreciate the gift to our ORE, Oakland Rotary Endowment. Let this be the demonstration of how we all can look to our service to Oakland Rotary and our continued giving to ORE even after our time doing work on this earth.
Thank you,
You
Ces.
all know how I love to issue challenges to the club. Well, here's one more. Let Gene's bequeath be the first in efforts to grow our ORE by $3 million over the next 3 years from estates of Rotarians. So talk to your estate planner and figure out what you can leave for ORE. I'm going to do it. I ask you to do it. I challenge you to do it as well. Thank you. Past President Robert Kidd, will you do the honor of introducing this week's Civic Thursday speaker?
With pleasure. Thank you, Ces. It's my pleasure to welcome Eric Foner, a professor emeritus of history at Columbia University. He joins us this afternoon from his offices in New York City. Professor Foner is the preeminent historian of the American Civil War and the period known as Reconstruction that followed. He's authored more than 25 books on these topics, including The Fury Trial, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010. In 2019, he published The Second Founding, a study of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution. These amendments are central to the controversies that continue to this day regarding voting rights, civil rights, and the future of the Republic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Foner.
Thank you, Robert Kidd. I appreciate that. And thanks to the Rotary members for inviting me. I look forward to speaking with you right now for a little while. I hope to leave a little bit of time at the end for maybe a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to pass those along as I'm speaking. The Civil War and Reconstruction, as everybody knows, transformed American society in numerous ways, but perhaps the most tangible legacy of that period is these three amendments, which are still, of course, part of the US Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. They wrote a new definition of American citizenship into the Constitution and the rights that citizens are to enjoy, and a new relationship between individual Americans and the national government. So profound were these changes that, well, in my recent book, as was said, I call the book The Second Founding. It's not just that an alteration or two was made in an existing structure, but that really a fundamentally new constitution emerged out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the one we're living with today. Now, I've devoted a lot of my career to the study of this period, Reconstruction after the Civil War, but I have to admit that most people don't know very much about it. But as Robert Kidd just said, really, Reconstruction is part of our lives today, even if we're not completely aware of that. Many of the issues that are roiling our society today are Reconstruction questions. Who is entitled to be a citizen of the United States? That's being fought out every day on our southern border. Who should have the right to vote? That's always contested in our history. We pride ourselves on being a democracy, and yet half the time it seems like people are trying to stop other people from voting as well as encouraging them. That's a Reconstruction question. What about domestic terrorism? Yeah, that comes out of Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan and groups like that. How do you deal with terrorism? That was a fundamental problem for state and local governments during the Reconstruction period. And every session of the Supreme Court adjudicates cases arising out, particularly of the 14th, and now with voting rights such a problem, question mark, the 15th Amendment as well. I want to say one other quick thing about Reconstruction, which is that it's a perfect example of the premise that all historians, I think, accept, that what we think about history actually matters. It's not just an academic, obscure problem. Until very recently, Reconstruction was viewed as really the lowest point in the history of American democracy, a period of corruption, misgovernment, caused by, according to those older historians, the misguided decision to give the right to vote to African-American men who, according to them, were just simply innately incapable of exercising the right to vote intelligently. That view dominated historical writing and popular consciousness well into the 20th century. That's what I learned in high school in the suburbs of New York City. Now, I'm not talking about Mississippi. I'm talking about Long Beach, Long Island. That's the Reconstruction history I learned there. The Civil Rights Revolution kind of shattered that view. Sometimes the Civil Rights Movement was called the Second Reconstruction. But up to that point, this view of Reconstruction was really, it wasn't just a historical interpretation. It was part of the intellectual edifice, the legitimation of the Jim Crow South, because the lesson of that view of history was very clear. The South, the white South, was justified in taking the right to vote away from African Americans, as they did in the early part of the 20th century. And if those rights were ever restored, you'd have a replay of the so-called horrors of Reconstruction. Today, I think no historian holds to that original view. Today, I think Reconstruction is seen as a laudable effort to create, for the first time in our history, a interracial democracy in this country, something that had never existed up through the Civil War. And the effort to create a new kind of social and political order from the ashes of slavery was really what Reconstruction was all about. And key to that, among other things, was these three constitutional amendments. The first one, the 13th, irrevocably abolished slavery throughout the United States and introduced the word slavery for the first time into the Constitution. The founders had talked about other persons held to labor. They didn't put, they protected slavery, unfortunately, but they did not put the word slave or slavery into the Constitution. Now, in the act of abolishing it, slavery is named in the Constitution. This was a remarkable change in American life. There had been 4 million slaves in the United States on the eve of the Civil War. Slave owners were the richest people in the United States. Slavery was critical to the American economy at that time. Now it was abolished, and not only abolished, with no compensation to the owners. Slaves were property according to state law, but now that property is just abrogated with no monetary compensation whatsoever. But the 13th Amendment also contained a loophole, which was unfortunately very tragic, which is that it said involuntary servitude could continue for those convicted of crime. And this opened the door, not intentionally, it was inadvertent really, but it opened the door to a massive system of convict labor, which was utilized in the South and in fact in smaller ways in the rest of the country in the late 19th, early 20th century, particularly in the South. Large numbers of African Americans were simply convicted of minor offenses, put into prison, and then leased out to work for mines or plantations or railroads, etc. And the courts always ruled that that was allowed under the 13th Amendment. One of the points I want to make, or I do make in my book, is that we hear a lot in terms of Supreme Court of original intent, original meaning. We should interpret the Constitution through those original things. But here you have an example where something that was unexpected, unintended, actually became an important part of the meaning of the 13th Amendment. But the abolition of slavery did not tell us what role these 4 million freed people were going to play in American life. Were they going to have the same rights as white people? Would they be citizens? Would they have the right to vote? Would they have economic opportunity? The 14th Amendment, enacted in 1866 by Congress, tries to address the question of the status of these former slaves, but also the fundamental question of what does it mean to be a free person in the United States in the wake of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment is a long, complicated amendment, the longest amendment ever added to the Constitution. It has 5 sections. Some parts of it have virtually no jurisprudence, although actually they've popped up lately. Some of you may have noticed people talking about the 3rd section of the 14th Amendment in the aftermath of the events of January 6th of this year. Before that, if you had asked anybody, including law professors, what is the 3rd section of the 14th Amendment, none of them would be able to tell you. But what it is, it was an effort to keep leading Confederates out of public office. And it says that any person who takes an oath to defend the Constitution and then gives aid and comfort to those, the enemies of the Constitution, is forever barred from public office. And there were those who said, well, this really should apply to President Trump, former President Trump. He took an oath to defend the Constitution, and then he incited a riot that certainly tried to overturn a constitutional process. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a law professor, but that issue is still perhaps out there. The 2nd section of the 14th Amendment is also maybe coming back into a little bit of interest. That says that if states deny to any male citizen, and then later women would be included also, the right to vote, the state will lose some of its members of Congress. So for example, at that time, Mississippi was, let's say, 50% black, 50% white. If Mississippi denied black men the right to vote, they'd lose 50% of their members of Congress. That has never been enforced, but I believe it should be. Today, there are states like Georgia, like Texas, like others, which are actively engaged in suppressing the right to vote. The 2nd section of the 14th Amendment says they should lose members of Congress then. But the key to the 14th Amendment is the 1st section. That begins by saying that anybody born in the United States, except Native Americans living on reservations, I'm translating this out of legal language into common language, are citizens of the United States. This is the principle of birthright citizenship. Remember, before the Civil War, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision ruled that no black person could be a citizen, free or slave. Citizenship was for white people only. Now the Constitution has been amended to say anybody born in the United States, doesn't matter what your race is, your religion, your language, it doesn't matter where your parents came from, it doesn't matter who your parents are. You're a citizen if you're born in the United States. This is controversial today because of people who come without documentation from across the southern border, and then a woman may have a child in the United States. The parent is an undocumented immigrant, but the child is definitely a citizen, no question about that. That's what the 14th Amendment says. It's no different than if your parents are bank robbers. You're still a citizen if you're born in the United States. In other words, the crime of the parent does not translate down to deprive the child born here of citizenship. And then the 14th Amendment goes on to say that these citizens are to enjoy a whole bunch of rights, most importantly, the equal protection of the law. The 14th Amendment puts this concept of equality into the Constitution for the first time. The original Constitution doesn't say anything about equality. That comes in with the 14th Amendment, equal protection. That, excuse me, pardon me, that abrogated laws in every single state. There wasn't a state in the Union before the Civil War that didn't have some discriminatory legislation against African Americans. But now all that is wiped away. Very importantly, the language is race neutral. It doesn't talk about blacks, whites. It talks actually about all persons in the United States, not even citizens, persons entitled to the equal protection of the law. And that has made the 14th Amendment in the 20th century a vehicle by which all sorts of groups claimed greater rights because they were being denied the equality that they were promised in that amendment. And finally, then, the 15th Amendment is meant to guarantee the right to vote of African-American men. The women's rights movement at that time was quite unhappy that it did not prohibit, that it did not enfranchise women, but it said that no state can deny you the right to vote because of race. Again, that's a fundamental change. Before the Civil War, only a couple of states in New England actually allowed black men to vote, and they're 2 or 3% of the population. Now race cannot be used, but this, just like the 13th, that's a kind of a loophole. It doesn't ban other kinds of voting discrimination, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, having a driver's license ID, all sorts of ways that are not explicitly racial, but can be used and were used and are being used to directly affect not only African Americans, but poor people more generally who may not be able to meet those qualifications. But certainly the disparate impact of these measures on Black people should, in my opinion, suggest that they are barred by the 15th Amendment, even though the Supreme Court has generally allowed these restrictions on voting to go through. At the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th, the Southern states all eliminated the right to vote for Black men, part of the Jim Crow system of the South. And they did it through laws that were not explicitly based on race. And again, the Supreme, one of its worst decisions ever, Giles v. Harris, 1903, the Supreme Court ruled, look, if the white people of Alabama want to take the right to vote away from Black men, there is nothing we can do about it. In other words, the Constitution can be abrogated with impunity. The Constitution is not self-enforcing. Someone has to enforce it. If the Supreme Court withdraws from that, it helped to create a very long period of inequality. Now, I'm going to stop in a minute or two here to leave a little time for a question or two. But what is the point I'm making here? Number one, that we should be aware of the radical change in the nature of American identity and equality and citizenship that came about in the Reconstruction period. But we also have to remember that rights can be gained and rights can be taken away. There is no inevitable just progress toward greater and greater rights in our country. And if you look at the history of these amendments, I'm not going through a million different Supreme Court cases, there was a period of Reconstruction which was a remarkable era of democratic equality. It was overturned by racist violence, the Ku Klux Klan and groups like that. It was followed by a long period, Jim Crow, where these rights were overturned. They were reinvigorated during the Civil Rights Revolution, the Second Reconstruction, which turned to the 14th and 15th Amendments as their legal strategy. And they're still being contested. We live in a society where, in a way, as I said, we are still refighting the battles of Reconstruction. So one thing we ought to do is familiarize ourselves with what Reconstruction was all about, why these things were added to the Constitution. And I see someone is posting here that, yes, the TV series Amend, 6 hours on the 14th Amendment, is well worth watching as a much more longer history of these questions. Well, I'm going to stop there. I could go on much greater length, but maybe we could take a couple of questions before the meeting adjourns.
Okay. Susie, do we have any questions for the?
We do. The first question is from Deborah Barnes, and her question is, why did the 40 acres and a mule promise get canceled after Lincoln died? Talk about the so-called cancel culture.
Yeah, 40 acres and a mule is a very important question. This is a lot of people who don't know anything about Reconstruction at least have heard of this phrase 40 acres and a mule, partly because it's the name of Spike Lee's film company. It's a very complicated story, but the fact is that most African Americans coming out of slavery insisted that they should enjoy all the rights, the civil rights, the political rights that free white people enjoyed. But also they said, we deserve they didn't use the word reparations. It wasn't part of the political language then, but we deserve some kind of compensation for the labor that we have done. You know, in his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln spoke of the 250 years of unrequited toil, unpaid labor. What is the nation's responsibility for 250 years of unpaid labor? Black said, the responsibility is give us land, give us land. Then we can be truly free. Then we can be economically independent. Then we won't be dependent on white people for our livelihood. And in early 1865, General William T. Sherman, operating then in Savannah, did set aside a large part of land in South Carolina and Georgia for the settlement of Black families in plots of 40 acres of land. Plus, he said the army, which had thousands of mules hauling things around, would give these farm families a mule. And that's the origin of 40 acres and a mule, General Sherman's Field Order number 15. Lincoln didn't say anything about it. Lincoln was a very cagey guy. What did Lincoln think about 40 acres and a mule? We don't know. He didn't approve it, but he didn't disapprove it. He let it go forward. Lincoln wanted to see what would happen. Unfortunately, after Lincoln was assassinated, his successor, Andrew Johnson, was a deeply racist Southern Unionist Democrat, I guess, who was certainly, again, he understood slavery was gone and that the Union was preserved, but he had no interest in the rights of Black people, and he ordered all this land restored to the former owners. So the promise of 40 acres and a mule was rescinded, so to speak, and therefore, you might say in Reconstruction, the political revolution went forward, but the economic revolution was much less vigorous. Black people emerged from slavery without property, without any kind of economic wherewithal, and with no real alternative but to go back to work for white employers, and therefore the prospect of economic opportunity was severely limited in the South. Okay, I'm going to stop and maybe take another question.
Okay, yeah, and I think that answers Harold's question. He said there are two key parts to Black Reconstruction: citizenship and financial support. Slaves never got the financial support and were rarely able to take advantage of the Homestead Act. How can you explain giving land to foreigners and not Blacks?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfectly good question. Out in the West, during the Civil War, the Homestead Act said that it was actually an interesting act. Anybody, male or female, Black or white, didn't matter, could get 160 acres of land from the federal government in the West, public land. And if they farmed it for 5 years, it would become their property. How come they could do that and they couldn't take land in the South and give it to African Americans? Well, the argument of people at the time was, well, the land in the West doesn't belong to anybody. You can't take land that is owned by somebody and give it to someone else. But the land in the West is just empty, public land. Now that, of course, is ridiculous. It was owned by Native Americans, but they didn't count. And even President Lincoln was strongly in favor of, in effect, taking all the land from Native Americans and giving it out to white settlers or Black settlers, if any of them went out there. But most African Americans coming out of slavery were not in a position to move out to Kansas or Nebraska or Colorado and start farming there. You know, to farm, you need more than land. You need credit, you need tools, you need fertilizer, you need experience. Growing cotton in South Carolina is not the experience that's going to help you all that much out on the Great Plains. So So it is certainly important to note, though, that a lot of land was being given away at this time, but very little of it ended up in the hands of the former slaves.
Next question. Susie.
Okay, Mike Murray wants to know, are the second and third sections of the 14th Amendment self-activating, or would it require an act of Congress to, for instance, prevent Trump from running again, or reduce?
That's a great question. That has been debated a lot. I myself wrote a little op-ed in the Washington Post about this. The second section about depriving states of membership in Congress is supposed to be self-activating. It says that these states shall be, their representation shall be reduced. It doesn't say might be reduced, could be reduced, may be reduced, but it still would need somebody to say, well, okay, let's say Texas has 30 members of Congress and they've deprived 10% of their population of the right to vote. They should lose a bunch of congressmen. But who decides which of those 30 is no longer eligible? The House of Representatives would have to figure that out. It has never happened, even in the Jim Crow era, when a majority of the population of some states was denied the right to vote. Congress never enforced this. The third section actually was enforced briefly in Reconstruction. There were local officials, ex-Confederates, local officials who Congress barred from holding office because they had supported the Confederacy, taken an oath to support the Union, but then went and supported the Confederacy. They ordered them removed from office. So it would presumably require some kind of act of Congress, a declaratory act maybe, saying, well, this person is barred from office as an implementation of the third section of the 14th Amendment. Now, it hasn't been used in a long, long time, so there's no real precedent for how that would happen. I don't know, but it's unlike impeachment. Impeachment requires a 2/3 vote to remove the president from office. Enforcing the third section of the 14th Amendment would only, I think, require a majority vote of Congress. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen, but it's out there as part of the, and if they're talking about having investigations and committee to look into the riot of January 6th, if that investigation concludes that the president actually encouraged or incited a riot, then Congress can say, well, here's the evidence and this is what we're declaring. Therefore, the ex-president is barred from public office. Will it happen? I don't know. Probably not, but it could. It's in the Constitution.
Okay, next question.
Roland Edwards is asking, Congressman Benny Thompson has filed a lawsuit that refers to the KKK. Is that suit based on the 14th Amendment?
Yeah, good point. The KKK and the KKK Act. An important thing about these three constitutional amendments is each one ends with a section saying Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment. That itself is a fundamental change in our federal system. The Bill of Rights from 1791 was all directed at the federal government. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, etc. Now, Congress is given the power to override the states. The 14th, 15th Amendment are to be enforced by Congress. In other words, Congress is now seen as a defender of people's liberties, not a danger to them. One of the enforcement acts, the so-called Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, justified by the 14th Amendment. It was a law to prevent mobs, riots, individuals from acting in a conspiracy to deny others their constitutional rights. This was a very far-reaching law because it punished individual crimes through congressional action. Most crimes are state crimes, right? I mean, if you commit murder, you're tried in a state court. It's not a federal crime. However, to enforce the 14th Amendment, they passed the Ku Klux Klan Act that these kinds of actions and conspiracies are now federalized because Congress is given the power under the 14th Amendment to do that. So this lawsuit that you mentioned, I'm not 100% certain about exactly what it says, but it does ask the courts to use the KKK Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, to punish people who were involved in or incited the riot of January 6th and make those federal offenses as well as local ones.
Mhm. Next question, Susie.
Okay, Robert Kidd's question is, assuming that HR 1 can be enacted, what predictions, or do you have any predictions about its reception by our current Supreme Court?
First of all, I wish I could be so confident that HR 1 being the voting rights law, which attempts to bar many of the methods that have been used to deny people the right to vote and expand the registration system. You know, one of the things that people don't even realize really is there is no positive constitutional right to vote in this country. There are parts of the Constitution now that tell you you can't deny someone the right to vote because of race. You can't because of sex. You can't do that because of a poll tax. But it doesn't tell you, other than that, who actually has the right to vote. That is determined by the individual states. And indeed, if you move from California to Texas, you might lose your right to vote because the regulations in Texas are very different than the regulations in California. There is no national standard for who should have the right to vote and who shouldn't. HR 1 is trying to remedy that to some degree. Now, what about the Supreme Court? As is constantly, reminding us, the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. Over a long period, from the 1880s to the 1950s, certainly, the Supreme Court, in my opinion, completely mishandled race cases coming out of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They interpreted the amendments in the narrowest possible way, partly because they held to this older view of Reconstruction. They saw these amendments as just part of Northern vindictiveness toward the defeated South, and they weren't real amendments. I mean, they're in there, but really they're distasteful to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court spent most of its time with the 14th Amendment, using it to defend the rights of corporations against regulation by the states, not the rights of African Americans. What will the current Supreme Court do with HR 1? I haven't the slightest idea. But, the Supreme Court, a basically similar Supreme Court a few years ago, overturned the key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the Shelby County versus Holder, the Attorney General then, basically saying, the Congress can't really just oversee the right to vote in all these states. So it's very possible that the Supreme Court would not look kindly on HR 1, and they might very well see it as a violation of federalism, that is, violation of the rights of the states within the national system. I don't know. Would these justices or the 6 conservative ones want to really be seen as allowing the denial of the right to vote to thousands, if not millions of Americans? We'll see. I mean, it'll certainly get up there if that law does pass.
And finally, the last question I think that we have is, how do we apply lessons? This is Stephanie Cosenza. How do we apply lessons learned from Reconstruction to the massive divisions in the U.S. today?
Well, as I was saying at the end of my talk, I think, history doesn't give you direct lessons, and history doesn't repeat itself. 40 acres and a mule doesn't play the same role in the American economy today than it did in 1865. I think learning this history can make us more vigilant about our rights and more anxious to really actively defend them. A realization that rights, as I said, can be taken away. It has happened in our history. Even the Constitution doesn't enforce itself. Who was it? Jefferson, or many people actually in the 18th century said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So I think we should be alarmed, actually, at the anti-democratic processes that are being promoted right now in many states, and try to use whatever power we have to oppose them, because our democracy is still fragile. It's a sad commentary 200 some odd years after the American Revolution, but we still have a very fragile democracy in this country, and Reconstruction is a lesson both of what can be achieved, but also how it can be taken away.
Thank you, Eric, for being our speaker for today.
You're very welcome.
This year, our club is making the homeless crisis in Oakland a priority. To that end, and as our gift to you for being our speaker for the day, in your honor, we are making a donation to support our unhoused residents in Oakland.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Additionally, we would like to give you our Centennial book, which documents 100 years of service and friendship in the third oldest club in the Rotary world. Again, thank you, Eric, for being our speaker today.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Past President Robert Kidd, are you telling us about the teasing the next Thursday's meeting? Or is that, who's doing the tease for next Thursday meeting?
I think I'm doing it.
I am not. Someone else is.
David Stein. I know it must be you, man.
No, it's Maud. Maud.
Maud's ready to go. All right, Maud.
So as we focus on women's empowerment, next week's speaker will be the remarkable Bay Area documentary filmmaker, Abby Ginsberg, who will talk about her last film, Waging Change. The film profiles the inspiring women-led organization of tipped restaurant workers called One Fair Wage, whose goal is to raise the federal minimum wage from a shocking $2.13 an hour. Abby will talk about the collateral effects of such a low wage, along with the results of One Fair Wage's efforts before the pandemic and over the past year. You should be there. She'll be great.
Thank you. Maud, I'm sorry I didn't catch you on my agenda there. Thank you, Tristan, for the thought for today. Thank you, Alex, for updating on some of the district speech contests. And thank you, Jack, for honoring our fallen members. Thank you, Carrie and Keith, for introducing our newest members. And thank you, Robert, for introducing our speaker. And finally, a big welcome to Trish and Rebecca to membership in Oakland Rotary number 3, where service above self exists. But Jesse, before I wrap up this meeting, do we have any more bell ringers?
I think we do, but Dudley wants to talk about tonight's Cocktails with the President.
Ah, yes, Dudley.
I always want to talk, President Ces. So I'm wearing blue because in about 2 hours, the Drake Bulldogs kick off March Madness as the Cinderella team. Go Dogs. But in 4 hours, we have Cocktails with the President. It's our St. Patrick's Day special. We'll have some instructions on an Irish coffee. Make sure you go out and buy some fresh whipping cream. We'll make it up fresh and have a good time. Join us at 5:30. Jesse sent out a link.
Thank you so much. Dudley, now, Jesse, do we have any more?
We have 25 bell ringers. I may have missed a couple, so I print up the chat. So if I don't mention your name, I'll catch you when I do the chat.
25 bell ringers.
So we have Joe Garacala, David Kittner, Stephanie Casenza, David Stein, Mike Mowry, Fred Morse, Pat Williams, President-elect Dudley, John Clausen, Harold Lowe, Jason Weiselman, Ralph Sklar, Susie Yakamoto, Debo, Georgia Richardson, Karen Friedman, Amani Solomon, Peter Sherris, Mona Hall, Kimberly Cohn, and Stephen Blair rang the bell for honoring the Rotarians. Debo rang the bell again for Gene's generosity of his fantastic donation to the endowment. And Marie rang the bell, thanking the professor for some education.
Very good. That's 25. As everyone knows, the ringing of the bell is a $100 donation to the Oakland Rotary Endowment. And with that 25, we raised $2,500 for the Oakland Rotary Endowment in just this one meeting. Everyone remember. So I'd like to end this meeting as we always do. And that's the way it went on that 5,332nd club meeting on March 18th, 2021 at Oakland Rotary number 3, the third oldest Rotary club in the world. Everyone remember, Rotary opens opportunities for service above self. And for now, this meeting of Rotary Club of Oakland is adjourned. Great meeting.
Oh, interesting.
Very interesting.
I
Now,
love CJ's idea about